The iron shackle around her wrist was the first thing Calvin Weston noticed, and the second thing he noticed was that she was trying very hard to pretend it did not bother her at all. She stood in the back of Harlan Dodd's wagon, chained to the side panel with a length of rusted chain that rattled every time the wheels hit a rut in the Coldwater Trail. It was market day in Fenwick's Crossing, and Harlan had driven his wagon right into the center of the square, hitching his mules to the post outside the grain merchant's stall as if the orc woman chained behind him were just another piece of cargo he planned to trade. The morning was brittle with early autumn cold, the kind of cold that got into the chest and stayed there, and most of the townsfolk who gathered were dressed in heavy wool coats and wide-brimmed hats, crusted with the same red dust that coated every road in the Borderlands. Calvin had been standing at the farrier's stall, waiting for a pair of horseshoe nails and thinking about nothing in particular, when the crowd began to shift toward the center of the square with that particular mixture of curiosity and cruelty that crowds always wore when they thought someone worth looking at had been brought low. He turned to look, mostly because everyone else was looking, and that was when he saw her. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, and he was not a short man with green skin the color of deep river moss, broad shoulders that would have looked powerful if she had not been holding them so carefully still, and tusks that curved upward from her lower jaw in graceful ivory arcs. Her hair was dark and thick, pulled back from her face in a practical braid that had come partially undone, so that loose strands fell across her sharp cheekbones and her luminous amber eyes. Those eyes were level and unafraid as she surveyed the crowd pressing in around the wagon, and her jaw was set with a pride so fierce that it looked almost like anger, the kind of pride that only came from someone who had decided they would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them break. She was dressed in fitted travel, leathers the color of worn saddle hide, a close-laced bodice that cinched neatly at the waist and opened into a short collar at her throat, paired with snug riding breeches tucked into knee-high boots, the whole ensemble scuffed and road-worn but unmistakably hers, cut to follow the strong, feminine lines of her body rather than to hide them. A faded copper-colored sash was knotted at her hip. Wherever she had come from, she had not dressed like a prisoner. She had dressed like someone who expected to move freely through the world, and that made the chain on her wrist look all the more obscene. "Orc woman, strong back, good teeth," Harlan Dodd was saying to the crowd. He was a wiry, red-faced man with a surveyor's sharp eyes and a mouth that had never been taught to be quiet. Captured crossing the Grayville Pass without permits. Under the Borderlands compact, she's mine for debt labor until the fine's paid, or I can sell the contract. Anyone wants to make an offer, I'm listening. Calvin felt the nails of his left hand bite into his palm. He had grown up on the edge of the Borderlands, not far from where the human settlements thinned out and the great clan ranges began, and he understood in his bones the long, ugly history between his people and the orcs. He understood the wars, the treaties, the broken promises on both sides, the whole grinding machinery of distrust that had churned for generations. He did not pretend that history was simple or that either side wore a clean face, but he also understood the difference between justice and performance, and what was happening in the square right now was not justice. It was theater, and the audience was hungry for it. The orc woman's eyes swept the crowd and found his. He did not look away. He was not sure why, except that something in the quality of her gaze demanded that he not. She held his look for exactly one measured second, then looked away with complete indifference as if she had already catalogued him and found him unremarkable, and something about that indifference made Calvin Weston step forward. "How much?" he said. The square went quieter than it should have. Harlan Dodd blinked at him. "Calvin Weston, you're buying an orc labor contract." I asked how much. 50 silver crowns covers the fine and my trouble." Calvin had 38 crowns in the pouch on his belt. He was at market to buy seed corn for the winter planting and a new draw knife for the barn repairs he had been putting off since spring, and he could not afford to spend what he had on anything else. He stood very still in the cold morning light and thought about this clearly and practically, the way he always tried to think when the world got loud around him, and then he opened his pouch and counted out every coin in it. 38, he said. That is what I have. The compact fine is 25, so you are clearing 13 over cost. If you want to wait for a better offer, you can wait. Harlan squinted at him, then at the crowd, calculating. A few of the men near the front were already losing interest, drifting back toward the grain stalls and the tavern warmth. Harlan knew as well as anyone that sympathy for buying an orc labor contract was shallow in Fenwick's Crossing, and shallow sympathy meant thin bids. Done, he said, and held his hand out. Calvin placed the coins in it. He did not look at the crowd. He walked around to the back of the wagon, climbed up onto the step, and held out his hand to the woman. She stared at his hand. I need the key, Calvin said to Harlan, not looking at him either. The key sailed over his shoulder. He caught it, crouched down, and unlocked the shackle around her wrist. The rust had bitten into the clasp, and it took a moment, but the chain fell away, and he set it down on the wagon planks with a deliberate quietness, as though putting it down gently was a way of saying something he did not have words for yet. He stood and held his hand out again. The orc woman looked at his hand, then at his face. Her amber eyes were measuring everything at once. Then, without taking his hand, she stepped off the wagon herself, landing lightly and precisely on the cobbled street as though she had planned every inch of the movement, and stood at her full height looking at him with an expression he could not read. I am not your property, she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying a clipped accent that came from somewhere north of the Grayville Pass, the vowels a little too round, the consonants a little too deliberate, the way people spoke when they had learned a language with great care and wanted you to know they had mastered it completely. No, Calvin agreed. You are not. Then what am I? He considered the question. Free, near as I can make it. But we are standing in the middle of Fenwick's Crossing, and you do not have any papers, and that means you will be back in a chain before nightfall unless you come with me to my farm until we can work out something better. That is the practical situation. I am telling it to you straight. She stared at him for a long moment. He could feel the crowd still watching, some with open hostility, some with the dull fascination of people watching a man do something they cannot decide if it is brave or stupid. What is your name? She asked. Calvin Weston. Something shifted in her face so briefly he almost missed it. Durgash Stormbound, she said, and the name had the weight of a door closing behind her. A decision made. Your farm, Calvin Weston, she said. I will come, but I am telling you also straight, I do not work for anyone who has not earned it, and I do not sleep in a barn. House has a spare room, he said. Nobody is sleeping in a barn. She turned away from him and began walking toward his wagon, which was hitched near the western edge of the square, as though she had known all along where it was parked. He followed her, and behind them the crowd murmured, and Calvin kept his eyes straight ahead and did not give a single one of them the satisfaction of seeing him doubt himself. It took the better part of a half-day to reach the farm from Fenwick's Crossing, following the packed dirt road west through stands of wind-bent pine, until the land opened into Calvin's 40 acres. A cleared homestead sitting at the foot of a long granite ridge, sheltered on the north by a thick stand of birch, with a log cabin, a small barn, a root cellar whose door was half-rotted, and a kitchen garden that was doing well enough to be hopeful about. The irrigation ditch he had dug in the spring still ran clear, which was something. The fence posts along the east field were leaning badly. Durgash sat beside him on the wagon bench and said nothing for most of the journey. She held herself very straight, her eyes moving over the landscape in a way that was not passive. She was studying the ridgeline, the tree line, the positions of things, the way someone did when they were always working out where the trouble would come from and what they would do about it. He did not bother her. He let the silence settle. When the farm came into view around the last bend in the road, she looked at it for a long, slow moment. It is smaller than I expected, she said. It is what I have. The fence posts along the east field need righting. I know. And that roof on the barn is going to leak before winter. he sighed. I know that too. She said nothing else, but she was quiet in the way of someone filing information away rather than dismissing it, which he decided to take as a reasonable sign. He showed her the spare room first thing. It was small but real, a proper bed with a rope frame and a straw-stuffed mattress, a braided wool blanket, a window that looked east toward the ridge, and a peg on the wall for hanging things. He put a lantern on the small shelf by the bed and showed her where the water pitcher was filled each morning. He did not apologize for the size of the room or the plainness of it, because he figured she had not asked for apologies and would not want them. She ran one hand along the edge of the window frame, looking out at the ridge. You said free, she said. As near as you can make it. What does that mean exactly? It means I paid your contract debt and I have no interest in treating you like a debt owed. If you want to stay and work the farm until spring, I will pay you a fair wage and feed you, and that is an arrangement between equals. If you want to go now, I will give you what I can to help you along the road, and that is that. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. In the afternoon light coming through the glass, her amber eyes were almost golden, and he noticed for the first time how young she was, not much younger than him. He thought, somewhere in her middle 20s, with all the edges of someone who had lived hard and fast but had not lost the underlying quality of someone still capable of being surprised by goodness. You are a strange man, Calvin Weston, she said. People have said so, he agreed, and went to start dinner. The first week was careful and quiet, like two people learning the sounds of a new house without wanting to startle each other. Calvin gave her space, worked the east field alone in the mornings, tended the animals, repaired the root cellar door because the cold was coming and the root vegetables would not survive without it. He cooked simple meals, salt pork and beans, corn bread, boiled greens from the kitchen garden, and set the table for two without making a ceremony of it. Durgash spent the first 2 days doing very little except sleep, which surprised him, and then covering the fact that she had slept by being formidably alert and active for the following several days, which did not surprise him at all. He had noticed from the first night that she fought sleep the way some people fought pain, with a kind of furious, willful dignity that refused to admit the need. She would sit at the kitchen table in the evenings long after supper was finished, her hands busy with small tasks, mending a strap on her boot, cleaning the leather of her bodice with the neat oil rag he had set out, sharpening a small knife she wore at her belt, and her eyes would go soft and distant and then sharpen again, over and over, as she kept herself deliberately awake through what was clearly crushing exhaustion. He pretended not to notice. He put the kettle on and asked her about the Grayville Pass, and she answered in careful, measured sentences, and he listened. And eventually she would excuse herself and go to her room, and he would hear the bed creak and then silence, and he would stay up a little while longer and feel the house settle around them both. On the 4th evening, she came in from the north yard where she had been splitting kindling without being asked. He had heard the axe strokes from the field and come back to find a neat stack that was twice what he would have cut himself, and she sat at the table and he put a mug of pine needle tea in front of her, which was a thing his grandmother had made in cold weather, and she looked at it and then looked at him. You do not ask me questions about my clan, she said. No, most humans do. They want to know how many warriors, what territories, whether we are planning attacks. I am a farmer, he said, sitting across from her with his own mug. I do not need to know any of that. You are not afraid of me. I did not say that. He wrapped his hands around the mug. I said I am a farmer. I am also a man who believes in treating people the way I would want to be treated, and I would not want someone making me feel like an interrogation subject in their own kitchen. So I do not do it to you. She looked at him for a long moment, those amber eyes quiet and measuring. My clan is the Stormbound, she said finally, as though she had decided to offer it freely since he had not tried to take it. We range the northern passes. I crossed the Grayville to find medicine for my grandmother. She is a bone setter, the only healer in our winter camp, and there is a root that grows only on the southern slopes that she needs to make the compound for setting broken bones properly. I found it. I had it in my pack." She paused. "Harlan Dodd took my pack when he took me." Calvin set his mug down. "The medicine root, it is in Harlan's wagon. Wherever he has stored what he took from me, yes. I will go back to Fenwick's Crossing tomorrow and get your pack." She stared at him. "You would do that? It belongs to you. It does not benefit you. Your grandmother needs medicine and I know where it is. It benefits her, which is enough." He picked up his mug again. "I will leave early. I can be back by afternoon." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will come with you. It will be easier if I go alone. Harlan will deal with me straightforward. If you are there, he will make it into something else." The line of her jaw hardened, and he could see the argument she wanted to make building behind her eyes. The argument about not being someone who needed a man to fight her battles, about independence and pride, and the particular dignity of handling your own affairs. He watched her work through it, and then watched her reach the practical end of it, where the logic was simply that he was right about Harlan Dodd and she knew it. "Fine," she said. "But I am not staying in the house all day doing nothing. The east fence posts need setting," he said. "If you want something to do." She gave him a look he could not entirely classify. It had some irritation in it, and some amusement, and something else he did not have a name for yet. "Go get my pack, Calvin Weston," she said. He was back by early afternoon the following day with her pack. A worn leather satchel with copper rivets and her clan's mark burned into the flap, the symbol of the Stormbound, which he had studied on the road home and found he liked the shape of. Harlan had given it up with minimal argument when Calvin pointed out that confiscating personal medical items went beyond what the compact allowed, and Harlan was, beneath his bluster, a man who did not want genuine legal trouble. Durgash was in the east field when he arrived, and he pulled the wagon up along the fence line and held out the pack without a word, and she took it and held it for a moment with both hands in a way that was not quite an embrace but was close to one, a person holding something that had felt lost to them. Then she opened it and checked the root bundles, counting, examining, and the tightness around her eyes eased fraction by fraction as she confirmed they were intact. "Thank you," she said. It came out clean and direct and without qualification, and he understood that for a woman with her particular brand of pride, a clean, direct thank you was a significant thing. "The posts look good," he said, nodding at the newly uprighted fence line. "You had a bad technique," she said. "You were not tamping the soil firmly enough. It needs to be packed in stages, not all at once." "I will keep that in mind," he said, and she almost smiled. It became a rhythm. The farm needed so much work. The leaning barn roof that she had identified on the first day turned out to be worse than it looked, with several rafters showing early rot and the southern wall of the barn listing noticeably eastward. And there was something clarifying about the scale of the problem. They worked side by side on the barn repair for almost a week, Calvin sawing the new rafter boards and Durgash lifting them into place with the easy strength of someone who simply did not have to work very hard to manage heavy timber, which saved them both enormous amounts of time and scaffolding. She knew things about construction that he did not. Her people built differently, with green timber bent and notched rather than straight cut and nailed, and some of her suggestions for the rafter joints were so clearly superior to his approach that he had to simply stand back and say, "Yes, let us do it your way." She grew more comfortable by increments. The alertness in her never fully left. He suspected it never would, that it was simply who she was, but the fighting quality of it, the sense of a person bracing for an attack that might come from any direction, softened into something more like the ordinary watchfulness of someone who paid careful attention to the world. She began to tell him things without being asked. Small things first, the way her clan tracked the elk herds in the autumn, the name of the mountain she could see from her grandmother's tent, the plant they used to make a paste for cold weather cracked skin. Then larger things, The war 7 years ago, in which her older brother had been killed, and what that had done to her clan. The raid that had taken their winter stores 2 years after that, which she believed to have been conducted by a rival human settlement rather than bandits, as the authorities had ruled. The way she had grown up understanding that the world beyond the northern passes was both necessary, for trade, for medicine, for the occasional exchange of knowledge, and reliably dangerous. Calvin listened to all of it. He listened the way his father had taught him to listen, which was with his whole attention, and without the insult of trying to fix things that were not his to fix. He listened, and sometimes he asked a careful question, and she answered, and the evenings got longer and the kettle went on more often, and the fire in the hearth stayed lit past when either of them strictly needed it. He noticed that she never talked about herself as someone who had been hurt. She talked about events, people, the way things had gone, with a kind of even-voiced clarity that did not ask for sympathy and did not perform toughness. She simply reported the world as she had found it. It was one of the most honest ways of speaking he had ever encountered. He also noticed, because it would have been impossible not to, that she was beautiful in a way that he had no useful framework for, because he had not grown up around orcs and had absorbed, despite himself, all the usual human flatness about what was and was not attractive. But there was nothing flat about Durgash Stormbound. She was arresting, the broad, clean architecture of her face, the curve of her jaw, those amber eyes that changed quality with the light, going from gold to honey to a deep warm amber that matched the color of the birch leaves on the ridge in October. The tusks that he had initially registered as simply an unfamiliar feature he became entirely accustomed to within the first week, in the way you became accustomed to anything that was simply and consistently present. And somewhere past that familiarity, he found himself noticing how elegantly they framed the set of her mouth when she was thinking, and how when she was near smiling the curve of her lips went a particular direction that he wanted to study more carefully. He kept all of this to himself with great discipline and focused on fence posts and rafter boards. In the 3rd week of October, a group of men from Fenwick's Crossing came to his farm. There were 4 of them, led by a man named Gort Pruce, who owned a significant amount of land south of town, and who had opinions about most things that he shared freely and loudly. They came on horseback in the early afternoon, while Calvin was repairing the plow harness in the barn, and Durgash was in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the winter squash. Calvin heard them ride in, heard Gort's voice before he could make out the words, and came out of the barn to find the 4 of them on horseback in his front yard looking down at Durgash, where she stood between the squash rows with a wooden bushel basket on her hip and no particular expression on her face. "Weston," Gort said without looking away from Durgash, "we heard you took in an orc laborer. We want to talk to you about that." "You are welcome to talk," Calvin said, stepping between the horsemen and the garden. "Come down off your horses if you want a real conversation." Gort dismounted slowly, making sure the dismount communicated something about how little urgency the whole situation warranted for him. His 3 companions stayed mounted. "Town council had a meeting," he said. "Not a formal one, just some concerned men talking. The feeling is that harboring an orc without permits is a provocation. There is still a lot of nervousness since the Grayville incident. People want to know your intentions. She has a labor contract, which is a legal document under the compact. I paid the fine and the contract transferred to me, and she is working the farm. That is my intention. Labor contracts do not cover permanent residence," Gort said. "If she is going to be here more than 30 days, she needs a settlement permit from the council. Then I will apply for a settlement permit. The council is not inclined to issue one." "Is that a legal position or a personal one?" Gort's jaw tightened. "Calvin, I am trying to help you here. You are a decent man and people like you in Fenwick's Crossing. But you are making them nervous, and when people get nervous they stop buying your corn and they stop lending you equipment at harvest time and they stop inviting you to things. And life on a frontier farm gets very difficult very fast without neighbors who are willing to be neighborly. I am telling you this plainly." Calvin looked at him for a moment. He could feel Durgash behind him, still holding the basket, and he was acutely aware of the quality of her stillness. The way she was not flinching, not retreating, not saying a single word, just waiting with that enormous, quiet pride of hers. "I appreciate you coming out to tell me that," Calvin said, loudly enough to be clear. "What I want you to go back and tell the council is this. She is here on a legal contract, and she has done nothing wrong, and I will apply for the settlement permit through the proper channels. And if the council refuses it on anything other than a legal basis, I will take that refusal to the compact magistrate in Coldwater City. Beyond that, I would like you to consider what kind of men you want to be remembered as. It is a long life, and the frontier does not forget how people treated those who were defenseless before them." Gort stared at him. The three mounted men exchanged looks. Then Gort turned and remounted his horse with the same deliberate slowness, and they rode out. Calvin turned around. Durgash was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, and he realized it was because he had never yet seen her look at anyone with something that might be called gratitude that she had not immediately armored over with something practical. This time she was a half-second slow getting the armor on. "That will cost you," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "Are the squash ready to come in?" She looked at him for another moment, then turned to her basket. "Most of them. The ones on the south end of the row need another week." They brought the squash in together, working down the row in the brittle afternoon light, and he thought about the way she had said his name when she had first said thank you, clean and direct, without qualification. And he thought that, however much the next several months cost him in social standing and market relationships, it was probably worth it. They spent the rest of October and the beginning of November on a regime of focused winter preparation that left very little time for anything except work and sleep. The barn needed everything. New rafter boards, the south wall shored up with cut stone from the ridge, fresh straw laid in, the hay stored dry and covered. The root cellar needed restocking, and its new door needed weatherproofing with pine pitch. The cordwood needed splitting and stacking, more than Calvin had originally planned for because the autumn felt colder than last year and he wanted a comfortable margin. The cabin itself needed its chinking redone in two places where the mud had dried out and cracked away from the logs, and the window frames recaulked. They worked so well together that it began to feel natural in a way that Calvin tried not to examine too carefully. Durgash had a gift for physical problem-solving. She saw the geometry of things immediately, the leverage points and load lines, where force needed to be applied and where it needed to be redirected, and she worked without complaint or self-consciousness, simply doing what needed doing as efficiently as she could. And it made Calvin realize he had been fighting this farm alone for 3 years since his father died, and that fighting a farm alone was a losing proposition, and that he had gotten somewhat accustomed to losing. One evening in early November, when the first real snow had come and gone and left a thin white crust on the fields, he came into the kitchen after late barn chores and found Durgash sitting at the table with her head bent over something she was working on by lamplight. He had started a fire in the hearth and hung his coat on the peg by the door before he saw that she was asleep. It was the only time he had seen her sleep outside of her room. Her head had dropped to rest on her folded arms on the table, her breathing slow and even, and the lamplight made her skin glow warmly, and the loose strands of her partially undone braid fall softly across her face. The thing she had been working on was a small piece of bone. She had been carving a pattern into it, some kind of clan symbol, with a small tool she had made from a piece of steel wire bent into a hook. It lay near her hand. Calvin stood very still for a moment. He thought about waking her and decided against it. He went to the spare room and got the wool blanket from her bed, came back, and laid it carefully over her shoulders without touching her, and moved the lamp a little further from the edge of the table, and sat down in the chair by the hearth with a book he had been meaning to read since summer, and let her sleep. He read for about an hour. When she woke, it came suddenly, the way people woke who had trained themselves to come alert fast. Her head came up and her eyes were open and clear, and she took in the room and the blanket over her shoulders and him in the chair by the hearth and was quiet for a moment. "How long?" she said. "Not long," he said, which was not true but was the right answer. "You put the blanket on me." "It is cold." She looked at him. Her face in the firelight was very open, the way it rarely was, still carrying the soft unguardedness of sleep that she had not had time to replace with her usual careful arrangement. "You have been pretending not to notice," she said. "Every evening when I am tired." "You did not want me to notice," he said simply. The pause that followed was one of the longer silences he had learned to sit with in the months of knowing her, and he sat with it while the fire moved and the snow settled outside. "My grandmother says," Durgash said finally, her voice quieter than usual, "that the way to know a man's character is to watch how he behaves when he thinks no one is looking. You have been behaving the same way whether I was watching or not." "I only know the one way," he said. She looked at him for a long, serious moment. Then she picked up her bone carving and turned it over in her hands and said, "My grandmother's name is Thurga. She would find you very confusing." "I think I would like to meet her someday," he said. Durgash said nothing, but the corner of her mouth curved, and he turned back to his book and let her have the moment, and felt the house around them as something different than it had been before, something warmer and less provisional. The settlement permit application came back denied in the second week of November, just as Calvin had predicted. The council's written refusal cited vague language about civic stability and the ongoing sensitivity of border relations, none of which constituted a legal basis for refusal under the Borderlands Compact. Calvin had been ready for this and had already written a letter to the Compact Magistrate's office in Coldwater City. He sent it with the returning messenger and waited. Waiting was not passive. He went to Fenwick's Crossing twice in November, both times for legitimate market business: corn seed, a new draw knife, oil for the barn lanterns, and both times he went to the tavern, the Ironwood, and had one drink and talked to as many people as he usually talked to. He was not performing normalcy. He was simply being himself in his town, and making the implicit argument that a man could maintain his ordinary human relationships while also making a decision that some of those humans disagreed with. A few people were cold. Most were simply watching. Durgash did not come with him to Fenwick's Crossing in November. They had agreed, practically, that there was no need to make anything harder than it was before the magistrate's ruling came through. She used the time to do things she wanted to do. She spent 2 full days working on the root cellar organization, which she restructured in a way that maximized cold storage efficiency and used considerably less space than Calvin's original arrangement. She spent one morning on the ridgetop, looking north, and came back with a bundle of dried herbs she had identified and harvested. She carved in the evenings by the fire, the bone piece growing into something intricate and deliberate, and sometimes she talked, and sometimes she did not, and Calvin had learned which was which. The magistrate's ruling came in the last week of November, carried by an official rider from Coldwater City, and it was in Calvin's favor. The council's refusal was ruled procedurally insufficient, and a 90-day provisional settlement permit was issued to Durgash Stormbound pending a full review that would occur the following spring. Calvin read the document twice, set it on the table, and called her in from the root cellar where she was arranging the last of the turnips. She read it standing by the kitchen window, and he watched the quality of her stillness change as she read, becoming something slightly less braced. She set the document down on the table beside the lamp. 90 days, she said, and a review in spring, but it is legal status, which means Gort Pruce cannot do anything to you through the council without breaking the compact, and he knows it. You did this, she said. You wrote the letter and argued the case. I know how the compact works. My father was involved in 2 disputes with the council when I was young, and he made me read the whole document. Why did your father do that? He said laws were like tools. Useless if you did not know how to use them, invaluable if you did. He leaned against the kitchen counter. He also said the law was the weakest protection for people who depended on the goodwill of others, but the strongest protection for people who did not need goodwill because they had the legal text on their side. He thought both things were true at once. Durgash looked at him. She was still holding the edge of the document. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He died 3 years ago, Calvin said. Fever. I am sorry. Thank you, he paused. He would have liked you, actually. He respected people who were straight with him. She looked at him quietly for a moment, then back at the document. 90 days, she said again, but differently this time, not as a limitation, as something else. Winter came fully in December and settled into the farm with the heavy, permanent quality of a thing that planned to stay. The snow came deep enough to reach the lower barn window, and the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that Calvin had not seen since he was a boy. The kind that made the logs crack and the water in the kitchen bucket ice over overnight, and the air in the morning feel like breathing through cloth. He kept the fireplace going from before dawn until past midnight, and the woodpile they had built through October proved its worth. They were inside together a great deal, because outside was not survivable for extended periods without purpose, and inside was warm and lamplit, and full of the kind of domestic intimacy that builds gradually and without announcement. They played cards in the evenings. He taught her a frontier card game called Borderlands Fold, and she demolished him at it within 4 games, apparently having a natural gift for probability calculation that she did not bother to hide. She taught him to play a game from her clan that was played with smooth stones on a marked piece of cured hide, a territorial strategy game called Thomgrak, which he was correspondingly terrible at but kept trying. They read. He had a small collection of books from his father, and she turned out to have a voracious appetite for anything written, moving through his whole shelf by February and asking if there were more in town. He told her stories about the frontier, about the Borderlands history, about the things he had seen traveling south as a young man before he came home to take over the farm after his father's illness. She told him about the northern ranges, the great elk hunts in summer, the clan gatherings at the autumn equinox, the way the aurora looked from the high passes on clear winter nights, and he listened to her describe it with an attention that he knew was not entirely about the places themselves. It was a cold evening in late December when he first touched her hand. They had been sitting by the fire, close together on the bench he had pulled up near the hearth because the chill on the far side of the room was cutting even with the fire going well, and she had been showing him a figure she was making in the bone carving, the outline of a mountain, he thought, or possibly a running animal tracing the lines with one finger, and he had leaned close to see, and she had taken his hand and guided his finger along the carved lines to show him what she was showing him. And for a moment, they were just very close together, with the fire warm on their faces and her hand holding his finger, and neither of them moved. She released his hand and he stayed where he was, close to her, not retreating, and she did not retreat either, and they looked at each other in the firelight with the snow tapping at the window and the logs settling in the grate. "I am not afraid of you," she said, very quietly. And it was a different thing than what she had said before on the farm those first days, when she had been noting that he was not afraid of her. Now she was saying something about herself, and the direction of the observation was entirely altered. "I know," he said, equally quiet. "You should know also," she said, "that I have no desire to go. When the permit allows me to stay, I want to stay, not from necessity." She paused. "I want to be clear about that. I want to be clear," he said carefully, "about what I want. I want you to stay because this farm is better with you in it, and because you are the most honest person I have been around in a very long time. And honesty is not something I took for granted before, but I would miss it very badly now if it were gone." She looked at him steadily. "That is a careful thing to say. I am trying not to say too much too fast. And if I wanted you to say more." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. The firelight moved on her face, and the amber of her eyes was warm and full of something he recognized, because it was the same thing he had been finding it necessary to carefully manage in himself for the better part of 2 months. "Then I would say," he said slowly, "that I think about you a great deal when we are not in the same room, and that I am not entirely sure what to do with that." She said nothing for a moment. Then she reached out and turned the bone carving over in her hands. "The figure I am making," she said. "It is a mountain, Thormak we call it, the highest peak in the Stormbound range. Every clan member carves it once in their life when they have found the place they intend to return to." She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in the glance that was carefully and deliberately not hidden. "I started carving it when I decided I wanted to stay." He looked at her. The fire shifted. "Durgash," he said. "Yes." "Can I?" He stopped. "Yes," she said before he had finished, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and felt the warmth and the strength of her grip come back around his. They sat like that by the fire while the winter night pressed against the windows, and it was not complicated, and it was not rushed, and it was something he thought he might want to hold onto for a very long time. January brought a new difficulty in the form of a hard storm that lasted 4 days, and brought the worst snowfall Calvin had seen in a decade, drifting up to the cabin's eaves on the north side and burying the path to the barn entirely. They worked in shifts to keep it clear, one sleeping while the other watched for ice forming on the chimney cap, trading the hours of rest with the matter-of-fact practicality of 2 people who had gotten genuinely good at working together. On the second night of the storm, the fire in the hearth surged with a backflow of wind down the chimney, and a burning log rolled and cracked the iron fire guard and sent a cascade of coals across the hearthrug. Calvin was up and stomping them out before his mind had fully caught up with his body, but the rug was scorched in 2 places, and a coal had landed near the wooden chair and charred the leg. Durgash appeared in the kitchen doorway within seconds, holding her lantern, wearing the heavy wool shirt he had given her for the cold months over her travel leathers, her hair loose from its braid. "The chimney," he said. It drew back. She was already looking at the damage, taking inventory. "The rug can be replaced. The chair leg, let me see." She set her lantern on the hook and crouched beside the chair, examining the char. "Deep on the outside, but it has not burned through the structural part. It will hold. I need to get on the roof in the morning and check the chimney cap. In this storm you will not get to the roof. It can wait until the wind drops." He righted the fire guard and secured it more firmly. The coals were all dead now, and the room smelled of scorched wool. He sat down heavily in the undamaged chair. "My father built that fire guard," he said. "It was always a little too narrow for the grate." She sat down across from him, cross-legged on the floor near the fire. She often sat on the floor, he had noticed, more comfortable on low ground than in chairs, and he had stopped noticing it as anything other than simply her way. "Tell me about him," she said. It was the first time she had asked him to talk about his father rather than his father simply coming up. So he talked. He talked about his father building this cabin from the timber of his father before him, adding the east room and the stone fireplace and the irrigation ditch, and the whole slow, careful project of making something out of land that wanted to be wild. He talked about winter nights like this one, when his father would pull out a fiddle. He could barely play and attempt songs that his own mother had taught him, badly but with great enthusiasm, until everyone in the cabin was laughing. He talked about being 17 and sitting at this same table while his father explained the Borderlands compact to him line by line, because his father thought understanding the rules was how a man kept himself and the people around him free. Durgash listened. She had pulled her knees up to her chest and her chin rested on them, and the firelight was warm on her face, and she watched him the way she always watched him, fully, without performance, just with her complete and clear attention. "He sounds like someone who loved this land," she said. "He did. He used to say that land is the only honest thing in the world. It gives back exactly what you put in, and it does not lie about the weather. Your grandmother, she asked, died when I was 12. Before that she came every autumn for a month. She made the pine needle tea. I thought that was an old recipe. Durgash smiled, a real one, the kind he got occasionally and had learned to notice, because they were not common enough to take for granted. My grandmother makes something similar from spruce bark. Maybe your grandmother and my grandmother would have gotten along. My grandmother gets along with very few people, Durgash said, but she respects pragmatic ones. Your grandmother sounds like she was pragmatic. She was absolutely terrifying, Calvin said, and Durgash's smile deepened, and he felt the familiar rush of something warm and specific that he had gotten used to identifying, and then setting carefully aside, except that now, since the evening by the fire in December, he had been somewhat less rigorous about setting it aside, and the setting aside was getting noticeably harder. The storm broke on the 4th day. The morning after, the world outside was absolutely silent and impossibly white, every surface smoothed and built up and rounded into new shapes, and Calvin went out in his heaviest coat to begin the work of digging out, and Durgash came with him. And they worked through the morning in a companionable silence broken only by the sound of shoveling and the creak of tree branches releasing their snow loads. Calvin was on the barn roof by mid-morning, checking the chimney cap and clearing the packed snow from the east side, when the wooden ladder he had propped against the eave shifted in the soft snow at its base and went sideways, and he went with it, catching the edge of the roof with one arm and hanging for a long, graceless moment before dropping, not a devastating fall. The snow was deep enough to cushion it considerably. But he landed badly on his right ankle, and it buckled under him, and he went down into the snowbank with a bitten-off curse that was loud enough to carry. Durgash was at his side before he had finished the curse, crouching beside him in the snow, one hand on his shoulder and one already moving to his boot. "Do not move it yet," she said. "I know," he said through his teeth. She felt along the ankle with both hands, careful and systematic, and he breathed through it and let her. "Not broken," she said. "Badly twisted. You need to get inside and get it up and cold packed. I need to finish the roof first. You are not finishing anything on that ankle." She was already pulling him up with one arm around his back, her strength direct and unself-conscious, bearing most of his weight without comment. "The roof will keep. You will not get worse by leaving it for a day. The snow load on the east side, I will clear the snow load." She started moving them toward the cabin door, matching her stride to his hobbling one. "I am not going to argue with you about this. You are going inside, your foot is going up, and I am clearing the roof. You have not been on that roof." "I have been on steeper ones," she said flatly, and he decided, with the ankle making the decision somewhat easier than it might have been, to stop arguing. He spent the afternoon on the kitchen bench with his foot elevated and cold-packed with snow in a cloth, which was Durgash's prescription, and listened through the wall to her working above him. Her footsteps careful, and even on the roof boards, the scrape of the snow shovel, the knock of the clear tool against the chimney cap, and felt a warm, strange, helpless gratitude that he did not know what to do with except feel it. She came in at late afternoon with snow in her hair and on her shoulders, and the particular direct look of someone who has done a job and knows they have done it well. "The cap is fine," she said, hanging her coat. "Two of the east side boards have some flex in them that you will want to look at in spring. The rest is solid." "Thank you," he said. She came and checked his ankle, unwrapping the cold pack and feeling the joint again with those careful hands, and then she rewrapped it with a strip of cloth from the supply shelf, firm and even, and when she tied it off she did not immediately let go of his foot but held it in her hands for a moment, looking at it, and then looked up at him. He was looking at her. He was not being careful about it. She rose, and because she was rising from a crouching position beside the bench and he was lying back on it, she came up into his line of sight smoothly and inevitably and was quite close to him, and neither of them moved away. "The ankle will be better in 3 days if you stay off it," she said very quietly. "I will try," he said, equally quiet. "Calvin." She said his name carefully with the particular round precision of her accent, and he liked it very much. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I told you I started carving Thormac when I decided I wanted to stay. I want you to understand that I do not make decisions lightly, and I do not make them without being sure. I understand that about you, he said. Then you understand that when I say I am sure, I am not saying it to fill the air. Yes. She nodded once as if something had been agreed. Your ankle in 3 days, she said, and went to start supper, and he lay on the bench and looked at the ceiling and felt with very great clarity that he was in love with her. The spring review arrived in March with the mud and the early snowmelt. The council was required to make a formal determination about Durgash's settlement permit, and Calvin had spent 2 months preparing a document that laid out clearly every aspect of her presence on the farm, the work she had contributed, the legal framework of the compact, and the grounds for permanent permit issuance. He filed it with the compact magistrate directly, bypassing the local council, which was his legal right under Section 14 of the compact's border provisions. The hearing was held in Coldwater City on a raw March morning. Calvin and Durgash drove the wagon the 2 days' journey there and arrived the evening before, staying at a boarding house that was decidedly uncomfortable about Durgash, but could not legally refuse a compact permit holder lodging under the city's charter. The hearing room was in the magistrate's hall, a stone building near the market center, and it was full not because Durgash's case was particularly notable in legal terms, but because word had gotten ahead of them and there were people from Fenwick's Crossing, including Gort Pruce, who had come to make their concerns known to the magistrate. Calvin had expected this and was not rattled by it. He had the document and the legal text and 3 years of consistent good standing in the Borderlands community, and he made his case quietly and thoroughly, and the magistrate, a small, precise woman named Aldra Voss who had been doing this work for 20 years, and had the eyes of someone who had heard every argument twice, listened to everything, and then asked Durgash directly, "What are your intentions regarding permanent residence in this jurisdiction?" Durgash stood and answered. She was in her travel leathers, the copper sash knotted at her hip, her hair in its braid, her tusks and her amber eyes and her full height all exactly as they always were, and she said, "I intend to live and work on Calvin Weston's farm as a permanent resident of this jurisdiction, contributing to its productivity and its community, and to do so in full compliance with every applicable provision of the Borderlands Compact." "For how long?" Aldra Voss asked. "For the rest of my life, if the law permits it," Durgash said, without looking at anyone except the magistrate. There was a sharp intake of breath from the Fenwick's Crossing contingent. Calvin kept his eyes on Magistrate Voss. Aldra Voss looked at Durgash for a moment with those 20-year eyes, then wrote something in her ledger. "Permanent settlement permit granted," she said. "Subject to standard annual review. Next case." Outside the magistrate's hall, on the broad stone steps in the pale March sunlight, Gort Pruce and his companions gathered at the edge of the square, watching. Calvin and Durgash came out the main doors, and Calvin felt the weight of all those watching eyes from across the square and kept walking down the steps with his hands loose at his sides. Gort crossed the square toward them. Calvin stopped. "This is not over," Gort said, not threatening exactly. More like a man reading something from a map. "I know," Calvin said, "but this part of it is, and today that is enough." Gort looked at Durgash. She looked back at him, level and unhurried. Something in Gort's expression shifted, not softened, exactly, but moved in a direction that was less simple. He turned and walked back across the square, and Calvin did not watch him go, because Durgash had turned to look at Calvin with the morning light on her face and something in her eyes that he had learned to read and that still moved him every single time. "For the rest of your life," he said. "You said that, to the magistrate." "I said it," she agreed. "You do not make decisions lightly," he said. "I do not." The March air was cold and clean between them, and the square of Coldwater City went about its ordinary business all around them. Wagons and market stalls and pigeons on the hall roof, and he reached out and took her hand right there in the open where anyone who wanted to look could look, and she let him. Spring came to the farm like a reward. The ground softened and the irrigation ditch ran fresh and fast with snowmelt. And the early planting, the barley and the winter wheat went in on schedule, and the east field looked better than it ever had, with the properly tamped fence posts holding the straight lines that Durgash had insisted on, and Calvin had come to appreciate in both the practical and the aesthetically satisfying sense. They planted together most mornings, Calvin working the harrow and Durgash following with the seed, moving in the easy tandem of people who understood each other's rhythms. Sometimes she sang while she worked low, rhythmic songs in her own language that he asked her about, and she translated roughly, the words not having exact equivalents but the meaning being something like, "The ground is awake, the seed knows where to go, the summer is already in the root." He liked them very much. The apple trees along the south fence came into blossom in late April, and the whole south end of the farm smelled of it for 2 weeks, and Durgash spent a morning out among the trees looking at each one, and telling him which needed pruning and which were going to be heavy with fruit. And he followed her down the row, and listened, and thought that he had been living next to these trees for 30 years, and had never paid them the quality of attention she gave them in 2 hours. It was in the evening of one of those long, warm April days, when the light lasted well past supper, and the house was filled with the particular golden quality of late spring dusk, that she finished her carving of Thormac. He knew she had finished it because she brought it to him, set it on the table in front of him while he was writing in the farm ledger, and stepped back and looked at him with something on her face that was composed but careful, in the way of someone presenting something that matters. He picked it up. It was small enough to fit in his palm, and it was extraordinary the mountain rendered in the bone in fine, precise lines that built the shape from its broad base through the narrowing ridges to the peaked summit, with small details he had not noticed in her working on it. The indication of a tree line at its base, a suggestion of clouds near the peak, and at the bottom in the angular script of her clan's written language, 2 words. "What does it say?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "It says, 'I have come home,'" she said. He looked at the carving for a long time. Then he set it down on the table and stood up, and she was standing 2 feet away, and he crossed those 2 feet without overthinking it. He kissed her. It was careful and deliberate and warm. The way things were between them, nothing rushed, nothing taken, just the 2 of them meeting in the space between them that had been getting smaller and smaller since January and had, evidently, gotten small enough that it no longer made any sense at all. Her hands came up to his chest, and she kissed him back with the same care, the same directness, the same complete and unequivocal honesty that characterized everything she did. And when they separated, she was looking at him from very close, and her amber eyes were warm and full and entirely unguarded. "I have been thinking about that for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "So have I." Summer on the farm was the best Calvin had known in a long time. Not because anything went easily. The summer never went easily, with its droughts and its sudden rains and the constant work of growing things in land that wanted to be left alone. But because none of the difficulty felt solitary anymore, and he had forgotten how much of hard work was just about having company in it. They worked the farm through June and July with the particular focused energy of people who know what they are working toward. The north field, which Calvin had been leaving fallow because he could not manage it alone, they opened together and planted with a late-season mix that Durgash suggested. A combination of crops her clan used in the short summer northern ranges that were hardy enough to produce even in a late start, dense and nourishing and well-suited to a frontier winter's needs. He trusted her judgment completely by this point, not because he had suspended his own, but because he had watched her judgment operate for 8 months across every kind of situation, and it had been right far more often than not. They were in the north field on a hot July morning, Calvin at the far end checking the irrigation channels and Durgash working the row markers near the road, when 3 young men from the east came up the road on horses and stopped at the fence. Calvin heard her voice change before he heard their words, the quality of it, the flatness that came into it, and he dropped what he was doing and started walking. The men were maybe 20 years old, possibly younger, with the look of itinerant hands looking for seasonal work, and they had the kind of confidence that young men in groups sometimes developed in which they felt free to say things they would never say alone. Calvin came up along the fence line in time to hear one of them say something that he would not repeat later, something that involved her tusks and a coarse word, and the other two laughing. Durgash had turned to face them, her jaw set and her eyes level, not angry, exactly something colder than angry. But she had not said anything yet, which Calvin recognized as restraint, not because she lacked words but because she had learned, probably over a long time, that words cost her more than they cost others in these situations. Calvin walked up beside her and looked at the three young men across the fence and said, completely evenly, "Move on." The nearest one, the one who had spoken, looked at him. "We were just move on," Calvin said again, in exactly the same tone, as though he was prepared to say it as many times as necessary. They looked at each other, calculating. Calvin held the fence rail and looked at them, and there was something in his quality of stillness in that moment, not threatening exactly, but absolutely immovable, that communicated a very clear message about how this was going to go. After a moment that was probably longer for them than it was for him, they turned their horses and went. Calvin turned to Durgash. She was looking at him with that expression he had learned, the one that was composed on its surface but alive underneath. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the row markers. "The west channel needs redirecting," she said. "There is pooling near the third post." "I know," he said, and went to fix it. That evening after supper, she found him on the porch and sat beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched, and stayed there while the summer dark came in slowly from the east, and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the comfortable weight of her shoulder against his was one of the finest things he had experienced in a long time. In August, they sent the bone carving of Thormac north. It had been Durgash's idea, and Calvin had learned by now to follow her ideas. She wrote a letter to her grandmother Thurga, a long letter, written carefully in her clan script with the translation written below each line so Calvin could read it, which was a gesture he understood was significant, and wrapped the carving with it. She explained where she was, what the farm was, who Calvin was. She explained the permanent permit and the legal situation. She explained her intention. She did not ask for permission. She sent the information, which was the Stormbound way of saying, "I am telling you because you matter, not because I need your approval." She sent it with a trading caravan that was heading north through the Grayville in early September, which was the last safe passage before the autumn weather closed the high passes. She handed it to the caravan leader herself, at the trading post on the North Road, and Calvin stood beside her while she did it and watched her face as she let go of the packet, which was the face of someone who has made a choice completely and is living in the clarity of it. "On the wagon home," she said, "she will write back in the spring." "Will she say you should come home?" "She will say many things," Durgash said. "She will say this was not the plan. She will say humans are unreliable in ways that orcs are not. She will say the Grayville crossing is not getting safer and that my clan needs its people." She paused. "And then she will ask what you are like. And then she will wait and see. Thurga does not judge quickly. It is her best quality." He thought about this. "And if she judges badly," Durgash looked at him sideways, and the amber of her eyes in the autumn afternoon light was gold and clear. "Then she judges badly. I have made my choice, Calvin. I told you this. I made it fully, and I did not make it because I was without options. I made it because this," she gestured, encompassing the road, the farm ahead of them in the distance, "is what I want." He reached across and took her hand on the wagon bench, threading his fingers through hers the way he had that first December evening, and she held his hand back with the complete, quiet certainty of someone who had no unresolved questions. The harvest in September was the best the farm had seen in years. The north field with its late-season planting came in dense and strong. The root vegetables in the expanded cellar were more than Calvin had ever stored, and the apple trees along the south fence produced so generously that they had baskets to spare, and he brought 4 of them to the Fenwick's Crossing market and sold them at a good price. Gort Pruce passed his stall without stopping, which was not warmth but was at least not active hostility, and a woman named Elsa Merritt who ran the cloth goods stall bought a basket of apples and said, "They are beautiful. What did you do differently this year?" And Calvin said, "Better care of the trees," and left it at that. And Elsa Merritt nodded in the way of a woman who was willing to let sleeping dogs lie and appreciated good apples. There were still people in Fenwick's Crossing who crossed the street when they saw Durgash. On the rare occasions she came to market with him, and there were still conversations that stopped when she entered a room, and there was still the occasional ugliness from people whose minds were too small for the size of the world. But there were also, gradually, people who nodded to her and accepted the nod back. And there was the wheelwright at the east end of town named Damo Fitch who had watched Calvin standing between her and Gort Pruce on the first cold morning, and had decided, on the basis of that specific moment, that Calvin Weston was a man worth being on the right side of, and who had told 2 or 3 others, in the quiet frontier way of reputation building, that the woman on Weston's farm knew her timber and her stonework, and was as straight as they came. One evening in October, nearly a full year from the day he had bought her contract at the Fenwick's Crossing market, Calvin came in from the barn to find Durgash at the kitchen table with the lantern lit and her hands quiet in front of her for once, not working, just sitting, and on the table between her hands was the small bone carving of Thormac. He hung his coat and washed at the basin and came to sit across from her. She pushed the carving gently to the center of the table where it lay between them in the lantern light. "A year," she said. "Near enough," he said. "When Harlan Dodd drove that wagon into the square," she said, "I had been in the chain for 3 days. I had not slept properly in longer than that. I was past tired, past the point where pride helps almost." She looked at the carving rather than at him. "I saw you looking at me and I thought, this one will look away. They all look away. And then you said how much, and I thought I did not know what I thought. I could not predict what you were. I was not very sure what I was doing either," he admitted. "I know that now. You are not a man who does things without thinking, but you are also not a man who thinks so long that he misses the moment." She looked up at him, and her amber eyes were full and warm and present. "That first night when I was so tired at the table that I fell asleep, and you put the blanket on me and let me sleep, I was awake enough to know you had done it. I was not as deeply asleep as I let you believe." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "You were not. I was too proud to admit how badly I needed it," she said, and there was something deeply self-aware in the way she said it, someone who understood their own nature without apologizing for it. "And you pretended not to notice, because you knew I needed the pride more than I needed the acknowledgement." She paused. "That was when I started to understand what kind of man you were." He looked at her across the table. The fire was warm and the farm was quiet around them, a year of work and season and small daily accumulations of trust lying under them like solid ground. "Durgash," he said. "Yes. I would like to marry you, if you would want that. I understand there may be clan considerations and legal complications and ways that the Stormbound mark marriage that are different from what is done here, and I am prepared to learn all of it. But I want you to know what I am asking." She looked at him for a long time. The lantern moved on the table between them. "In the Stormbound tradition," she said slowly, "a marriage declaration is made when both people carve each other's names into Thormac. There is a ceremony before the clan. It is binding." She picked up the carving. "The legal human ceremony would also be needed for the compact status." "Both," he said, "however you want." She looked at him with those clear, serious eyes. "You would come to the Stormbound range." "Yes, to face my grandmother, my clan, people who have no reason to trust you and many reasons to distrust humans in general." "Yes." "Why?" It was a fair question. He thought about it with the care it deserved. Because what you told the magistrate is what I want to say to your grandmother. That this is permanent and I am not coming at it lightly, and I am prepared to be held to it by every set of rules that applies to both of us." She set the carving down between them very carefully. "Then my answer is yes," she said. "Both ways, yours and mine. But I am carving your name into Thormac first because I already know it belongs there." He stood up and came around the table, and she rose, and they were simply in each other's arms, his face against her hair, her arms around his back, and neither of them said anything, because everything that needed saying had been said, and what remained was simply the warm, unhurried fact of it. That night was when their love became fully physical, the two of them moving together with the same ease and communication they had developed across a year of shared work, and firelit conversation and tentative first touches. It was unhurried and tender and entirely honest. Two people who knew each other well, who had earned the knowing, who came together without pretense or rush, only with warmth and care and the great and generous attention that real love asked for. Afterward they lay in the dark of the bedroom with the window showing the first stars of October and her head against his shoulder and his arm around her, and he felt the weight and warmth of her completely and without reservation, and thought there was nothing in the world he needed to add to this particular moment. "Your grandmother," he said into the quiet, "is going to be difficult about this." "Yes," Durgash agreed. "I am prepared." She laughed softly. "You think you are prepared. You have not met Thurga." The letter from Thurga arrived in March, as Durgash had predicted. It was written on cured hide in the Stormbound script, and Durgash read it at the kitchen table with Calvin beside her, translating in a voice that was carefully level. And it was, as she had also predicted, full of concerns about the distance, about the human prejudice, about what it meant for Durgash's place in the clan, about whether Calvin Weston was a man of genuine character, or simply a man who felt better about himself when he was being magnanimous. But at the end, after all of that, there were two lines that Durgash read and then read again, more quietly. Calvin waited. "She says," Durgash said, "that she read the letter many times and that no stormbound woman has ever carved Thormac for a place she did not mean to return to. And she says that if the man is good enough for the mountain, he is good enough to meet the clan." She folded the letter. "She says come in summer." "We will go in summer," Calvin said. The journey north took 11 days in early summer, following wagon roads that turned to pack trails that turned to mountain paths that Durgash navigated with the easy confidence of someone who had walked these ways since childhood. They brought gifts, good ironwork from Damo Fitch's forge, a bale of southern cloth, 2 barrels of the apple cider from last autumn's press, and a smoked ham from their own pigs, which Durgash said was the kind of practical gift her grandmother actually valued. The Stormbound winter camp, which was occupied in the summer months as a base for the clan's range activities, sat in a high mountain valley ringed by peaks, the hide tents dark and weather-treated against the alpine wind, smoke rising from cook fires, the sound of children and dogs, and the clang of tools carried across the clear, thin air. Calvin came into it on foot beside Durgash, having left the wagon at the lower camp, and he felt all the eyes on him from the moment they entered the valley's edge. Orcs, dozens of them, going about the ordinary work of summer camp, curing hides, sharpening tools, tending animals, children playing near the creek, who stopped and watched the human man walk in beside Durgash Stormbound with a straightforward and unsentimental curiosity that was not the same as hostility, but was not far from wariness. Durgash walked without altering her pace and without explanation. She walked to the central tent, the largest one, from which came the smell of something medicinal and the sound of a low, steady voice, and stopped outside and said, in her language and then in Calvin's, "Thurga, we are here." There was a pause. Then the tent flap opened and Thurga came out. She was smaller than Calvin had expected for someone who had loomed so large in Durgash's descriptions, with deep green skin, weathered to the color of old bronze and white hair cropped close and eyes that were amber, like Durgash's, but darker, nearly brown, and absolutely without evasion. She looked at Calvin with an exactness that made him feel he was being measured with instruments he could not see. He held out the smoked ham. Thurga looked at the ham, then at him, then at Durgash. "He brought a ham," she said in accented but clear border speak. "He thought you would appreciate practical gifts," Durgash said. Thurga took the ham. She looked at Calvin again for a long, deliberate moment. Then she said, "Come inside, both of you, I have questions." She had, as it turned out, a great many questions. They sat in her tent for 3 hours, Calvin answering everything she asked with the same directness he used in every other part of his life, and Thurga listening with the focused attention of her granddaughter amplified by decades. She asked about the farm, about the compact legal situation, about the hearing in Coldwater City, about Gort Pruce and the men on horseback in the East Field. She asked about his family, his father, the land. She asked what he intended. "I intend to marry your granddaughter in whatever form that takes in your tradition and in mine," Calvin said. "I intend to live with her on the farm in the Borderlands for the rest of my life, and I intend to take seriously the obligations that come with being connected to the Stormbound clan, whatever those obligations are, so long as they are compatible with the life I am building." Thurga was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Durgash and said something in the Stormbound language, and Durgash answered, brief and certain, and Thurga looked at Calvin again. "My granddaughter says you pretended not to notice when she was too exhausted to stay awake," Thurga said, "and that you covered her with a blanket and let her sleep." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought about it. "Because she needed to sleep more than she needed to maintain her dignity, and one of those I could give her without her having to ask for it." Thurga looked at him for a long time. Then she put her hands on her knees and stood up. "You will stay 4 days," she said. "There will be a ceremony on the 3rd night. I will approve the carving of names." She picked up the smoked ham from where she had set it on the chest beside her. "This is a good ham," she said, and went out. The 4 days in the Stormbound camp were unlike anything Calvin had experienced. He was watched and assessed constantly, but not unkindly. The orcs he encountered were mostly curious, and their curiosity was the direct and practical kind that asked its questions openly and received straightforward answers and then moved on. He helped a man named Borgeth repair a cart axle on the 2nd day, because the axle had cracked and he saw it and had the tools in his pack. And afterward Borgeth clasped his arm in the Stormbound manner, and that gesture carried through the camp faster than anything he had said. On the 3rd evening, as the summer sun dropped behind the western peaks, Thurga conducted the ceremony with the full clan in attendance. A ring of fire, words in the old language that Durgash translated in a low voice beside him, the formal presentation of Thormak with both their names carved into it, Durgash's carving of his name beside the mountain precise and deliberate and final, and his awkward but sincere carving of hers in the clan script that she had taught him over the preceding weeks. The clan witnessed. Thurga spoke the binding words, and that was that in the Stormbound way. Thurga embraced Durgash after long and without words, and then she turned to Calvin and looked at him with those dark amber eyes and said, "You will bring her back to visit. The pass is open from late spring through early autumn. There is no excuse for absence." "We will come every year," he said. Thurga nodded, once, the way Durgash nodded when she had decided a thing was acceptable. The resemblance was so precise that Calvin had to work to keep his expression neutral. They were married also by the compact registrar in Coldwater City on the journey home, a brief and purely practical ceremony before Aldra Voss, who signed the ledger with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and said to Durgash, "Your settlement permit will be updated to reflect spousal status. Permanent. No further annual review required." And that was that, in the human way. They came back to the farm in late summer, and the farm was exactly as they had left it, because Damo Fitch's nephew had been checking the animals and the irrigation and had, as instructed, done nothing else. The apple trees were heavy with young fruit. The north field stood tall. The east fence posts were straight. Durgash stood in the yard and looked at it and then turned to look at Calvin and said, "We have a lot of work to do before the harvest." "We always do," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." And they went to work. Time moved the way it does on a working farm, not slowly exactly, but with a depth to each day that made the seasons feel full rather than fast. Their first winter as a married couple was much the same as the first winter had been, except that it was warmer, and not because of anything that could be attributed to firewood. The spring brought planting, and the summer brought the work, and the autumn brought the harvest, and they went north to the Stormbound camp as they had promised. And Thurga was there both warmer and more difficult than the first time, because Thurga was a woman who felt that familiarity allowed for more honest criticism, which was probably true. Calvin learned pieces of the Stormbound language across those first years. Not all of it, his ear not being as sharp as Durgash's, but enough to make himself understood and to understand the broad shape of a conversation, which mattered to him, because he wanted to be someone who could exist in both of her worlds without needing translation for everything. Thurga corrected his pronunciation with merciless precision and occasional humor, and he took the corrections without complaint and kept trying, and Thurga marked this and said nothing, which was how she expressed approval. In the second year, there was a challenge from a clan elder named Vrakat, who felt that Durgash's arrangement with a human was a weakening of the clan's integrity, and said so publicly at the autumn gathering. Durgash answered him herself, calmly and at length, and Calvin stood behind her and did not interfere, because he knew precisely which battles were his to be involved in and which were hers. She finished by noting that the Stormbound had survived 300 years by being practical rather than proud, and that Thormek did not care whether the arms that protected the clan were green or some other color, and that Vraket was welcome to his opinion, but she was going to go home to her farm now. She walked away from the gathering fire, and Calvin walked beside her and heard, across the ring of firelight, several voices say things that were not agreement with Vraket. It was not a defeat of the old prejudices, but it was a crack in the ground they stood on. Their son was born at the farm in the third spring, delivered by the traveling healer woman from Fenwick's Crossing, a pragmatic and unceremonious woman named Herda who had seen more unusual deliveries in the Borderlands than she cared to count, and who announced the baby's arrival with the same businesslike efficiency she brought to everything, and then stayed for supper because Durgash's stew was famously good in Fenwick's Crossing by this point, which was a form of social change that Calvin appreciated for its quiet thoroughness. The baby was strong and healthy, and had green skin and dark hair and his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and they named him Calvin Weston, Tarvik being a Stormbound name meaning, the one who comes from 2 rivers. Calvin held him in the evening light on the porch, with Durgash beside him looking at the apple trees coming into blossom, and felt the weight of the small life in his arms and the warm press of Durgash's shoulder against his and the farm around them in the long, golden evening of early spring. "Thurga will want to see him," Durgash said. "We will go in summer," Calvin said. "She is going to cry," Durgash said. "She will deny it, but she is going to cry." He kissed her temple. She leaned into it. Thurga did, in fact, cry. She denied it completely, attributing the moisture around her eyes to the campfire smoke, and everyone present accepted this explanation, and Thurga held Tarvik for the better part of an afternoon and told him things in the old language in a low, steady voice, and Durgash translated them afterward. She was telling him the names of the peaks and the paths and the old stories of the Stormbound, the things a child needed to know about who he came from. Fenwick's Crossing changed, slowly, the way frontier towns changed, not through any single moment of conversion, but through the accumulation of ordinary days in which the feared thing turned out to be not what people had been afraid of. Durgash came to market with Calvin regularly by the time Tarvik was 2, and people who had once crossed the street began to nod, and people who had once nodded began to talk, and a few people actually became something like friends: Elsa Merritt, who had judged good apples correctly; Damo Fitch, who had judged character correctly; a young farmer named Jor who had moved to the Borderlands from the south and had no old history with orcs to untangle, just the daily fact of Durgash at the market stall, who knew more about timber and soil and tool maintenance than most of the men in the square. Gort Pruce never became warm. He remained at the edge of things, not actively hostile after the magistrate's ruling, but not yielding either, a man whose convictions were too deep in him to be moved by evidence alone. Calvin did not expect him to change. He was satisfied that the man had been contained by law and by the slow pressure of community opinion, and he thought that was the realistic victory available, and that trying to claim more was the kind of thing that cost you the peace you had actually earned. Tarvik grew up moving between two worlds with the unself-conscious ease of a child who does not know they are supposed to find it difficult. He spoke both languages by the time he was 4, learned farm work and clancraft with equal enthusiasm, and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, which Thurga observed once with an expression that suggested she found it appropriate. The second child came when Tarvik was 5, another boy, also strong, who had his father's coloring and his mother's tusks, which Durgash said was exactly right because the tusks were the best part. They named him Durgash Stormbound Weston, the compound name being a deliberate thing, a statement about what he was and where he came from, the kind of statement that cost nothing but words and meant everything. Durgash's permanent settlement permit had become, by the time Edrin was born, something that almost no one in Fenwick's Crossing thought about anymore. It was simply a legal document reflecting a fact that had long since become ordinary. She was there, at the market and on the farm and occasionally in the Ironwood Tavern, when Calvin went for the sociable drink that frontier life made necessary. And she had been there long enough and straight enough and plain-spoken enough that most people had run out of reasons to find her remarkable in the wrong sense and found themselves, more or less, acknowledging her in the way of someone who had proven what they were. There were still hard moments. There were still strangers on the road who said things, and still men in the farther settlements who had not had Durgash Stormbound living beside them for 6 years, and did not know what she was. There was a bad week in the 5th year when a patrol of territorial militia came through, the kind of half-official quasi-military presence that the Borderlands attracted in tense political periods, and the patrol leader decided that Durgash's settlement permit needed additional verification, and said so, with the specific tone of a man who had decided to make things difficult for reasons he did not want to examine. Calvin produced the permanent permit and the Coldwater City magistrate's seal and the spousal documentation and the birth records for both boys, in that order, on the kitchen table, where the patrol leader could read them and make no argument. And then Calvin said, in the same even voice he always used, "I want you to be careful about how you proceed here. Because I have corresponded with Magistrate Voss's office since the original ruling, and she has an interest in how this family is treated under compact law. I am not threatening you. I am informing you." And the patrol leader, who was a pragmatic man under his bluster, looked at the documents for a long time and then said everything was in order and took his patrol and went. Durgash, who had been standing in the kitchen door through all of this with Edrin on her hip, waited until the sound of the horses had faded, and then she came and sat across from Calvin at the table. "You have been doing that for 6 years," she said. "Doing what?" "Standing between things and me." "You can stand between things perfectly well yourself," he said. "I just supplement." She looked at him. Edrin grabbed at her copper sash with a small, enthusiastic fist. "You are the person I did not know I was looking for when I crossed the Grayville," she said, and her voice had the quality it sometimes had, direct and clear and absolutely without ornament, the truth of a thing stated as a thing. "I was looking for medicine for my grandmother. I found you. I do not know what to call that except that I am glad of it every day." He reached across the table and covered her free hand with his. "So am I," he said. Every day. Years settled into them like rings in old timber. The farm grew, and the family grew, and the relationship between the Borderlands settlements and the Orc clans moved, with geological slowness, towards something that could occasionally be called understanding. Tarvik, at 14, went north for his clan naming, which was the Stormbound ceremony of adolescence, and came back with a name in the old language and a bearing that was new and very slightly taller than the one he had left with, and spent the following winter teaching Edrin the clan's territorial game, Thomgrak, with a seriousness that made Calvin smile. Thurga lived to see both boys named in the clan. She died in the winter of the 9th year, quietly, in her tent, in the way of someone who had arranged things to her satisfaction and was prepared. And the clan honored her for 3 days with fires and stories, and the kind of mourning that held the dead person's presence rather than simply marking their absence. Durgash grieved with the same directness she brought to everything, fully and without apology, and Calvin held her through the hard nights and said nothing that the grief did not need said, and she leaned into him and let herself be held, which was something she had been practicing for 9 years and had gotten much better at. On the spring morning after they returned from the Stormbound range following Thurga's death, Calvin found Durgash in the apple orchard at first light, standing among the trees in their early blossom, her hand on one of the oldest trunks. He came and stood beside her. She would have said, Durgash said, that grief is practical, that it tells you what mattered and helps you know what to protect. She would have been right, he said. She was right about most things. Durgash turned to look at him, and her amber eyes were clear, carrying something that was not over the loss but was through it enough to see the other side. She told me the last night that she was glad I had crossed the Grayville with bad permits and gotten caught by a fool with a wagon, because it was the only way she could imagine a stormbound woman being stubborn enough to end up somewhere new. She paused. She said to tell you that you passed every test she set, and a few she had not thought to set. That is the finest thing anyone has ever said to me, Calvin said. Durgash smiled, not the small, careful smile of those first months, but the full, open one she had learned to use without calculation, and the morning light came through the apple blossoms and fell across her face. Come have breakfast, she said. The boys will be up. He followed her out of the orchard and across the yard he had known all his life, which now held all of them in it. The log cabin with its sound roof and properly chinking, the barn that stood straight and solid, the east fence posts tamped correctly into firm ground, the north field with its mixed planting, the irrigation ditch running clear in the spring melt, and the kitchen where Tarvik and Edrin were already audible, and the fire was already going, and the kettle was already on. Because the boys had grown up in a house where someone was always already taking care of the next thing. There were years still ahead. Calvin knew years of work and season, and the ordinary accumulation of a life built honestly in hard ground. There would still be people on the road who said the wrong things, and councils who made things difficult for reasons that had more to do with fear than justice, and cold winters and late rains, and the 100 small crises of a working frontier farm. The Borderlands would not become peaceable overnight, and the history between humans and orcs would not be resolved in 1 generation, no matter how many people decided to do things differently. But the farm was here, and the family was in it, and Durgash Stormbound was walking ahead of him across the yard with the copper sash bright at her hip, and her hair braided back, and her amber eyes already moving over the morning's first work. And he had loved her long enough and well enough to know that the shape of his life was the shape it was always supposed to be, just wider than he had imagined, and fuller, and better by every measure that a man with good sense used to measure things. He came through the kitchen door. Both boys were at the table, Tarvik working on something in a piece of leather with the focused attention he had inherited from his mother, Edrin eating his porridge with one hand and holding a river stone with the other, probably for reasons known only to himself. Durgash was at the hearth, and she turned when Calvin came in and handed him a mug of pine needle tea, which she had learned from his grandmother's recipe and made every cold morning without being asked. And he took it and held it in both hands and felt its warmth and looked at her, and she looked at him. And it was the look they had between them across every room they had ever shared, full and clear and entirely without reservation. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and turned back to the fire. The morning light came through the east window, across the ridge and down through the birch trees, and fell on all of them in the kitchen. The father and the mother and the two boys who were both of them and neither of them only, who would grow up into a world that was still making room for what they were and who would, both of them, make that room larger by simply existing in it. And the farm settled into its day around them, and the fire in the hearth burned warm and even, and the kettle began to sing. Outside, the apple trees along the south fence were coming into bloom again, white against the blue spring sky, the same as they had been every April for as long as anyone on this land could remember, steady and returning, and very thoroughly alive.